Good morning.
Oh, no problem. There we go. Okay, good morning. Today is Thursday, the 23rd of March. It is day 50 of the class. And as it says, we will be going over chapters 6 and 7 from the Murach JavaScript book momentarily. Tomorrow is our typical Friday lab day with no taping done. Remember the test, if you have not yet turned it in for chapters 4 and 5, that test is due by midnight tonight. All right, this Sunday, your 4 and 5 written tests, labs, and homework are due. And next Sunday, all right, will be chapters 6 and 7. All right, we'll see next week. I'm not going to make anything due on Easter, which is the 9th, but we'll see how that all plays out next week. So let me close this. And I've kind of laid out something that I'm hoping we're going to be able to follow for the rest of the semester. So next week is the week of the 27th, and I'm hoping that by no later than a week from today, we'll be able to go over chapters 8 and 9, which are our first two chapters on jQuery. And the following week, chapters 10 and 11, which are the other two on jQuery. I'm going to look at the homework that's in there, and if I think it's too extensive, we'll only do some of it. Let's just put it that way. All right, then following that, we'll do 12 and 13, then 14, 15, and 16. Now, you'll probably have a test on 8, 9, 10, and 11, where I'll ask you to create a website using jQuery. All right. I'm not sure if you'll have any tests after that. I want to talk to Evan. We have our regular weekly meeting tomorrow. We meet at 7:45 on Fridays for 15 minutes. And I want to see towards the end of the book in chapters 12 through 19, how many tests, if any, he gave. All right. So I'll let you know that. And then when we get to here, notice I've got here React Thursday, Friday, and React Monday, Tuesday. Those of you this summer who will be going on and taking the AWD1111 class, one of the things that you go over in there is React. So what we'll probably end up doing, and everybody can do this, even if you're not going to be in that class, but we'll go back and we'll maybe take like the BMI app or something like that, and we will rebuild it as a React app so you can see what that stuff is like. I want to make sure that by no later, and if we can get this done in a couple days, that's great. Then this will be all week to work on this. I want those e-portfolios turned in by midnight on Thursday. I've got to have my grades in Friday. All right. And literally, we have 1 week between when these and summer school starts. The reason I'm telling you that is I am planning on taking vacation, and I'm planning on leaving Friday 5/5 at I don't know, no later than noon, and then I'm going to be gone for a few days. All right, just so you have some kind of an idea. That's why the schedule is the way that it is. So with that said, so far we've gone through chapters 1 through 5. I'm not going to read them. You can see them right in front of you. But again, today we'll go over chapter 6, fairly long chapter, and chapter 7, which is not a long chapter. All right. In chapter 6, as it says, it's all about the document object model. Now, you can get entire books on the document object model. So there's no way in heck that you become an expert on this by going over 40 to 50 pages. All right. But it's a good initial exposure to this. When we get done with 6 and 7, we'll take a look at the homework and the labs that will be assigned. And again, we will do several of them together. All right. So with that said, I'm just going to jump right into chapter 6, or attempt to, if it lets me. Okay, it's not letting me, so we got to do this. All right. It says here, at this point, you have all the JavaScript skills you need for some serious DOM scripting. The key thing about working with the DOM is what you are able to do is one of three things. You're able to add things to a web page, any place, at any time. You're able to modify anything on a web page, any place, anytime, and you're able to delete anything on a web page, anytime. All right. So that these ideas of being able to create something, update something, and delete something, they all go into talking about databases, which we don't get into in this class. But those of you who took the AWD 1100 class, the C# class last semester, you remember we talked about databases. We talked about what are referred to as CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete. Most everything we've been doing so far has been read. We've been setting something up or whatever, but now we're going to get into some other stuff, so to speak. So as you can see, all right, we're going to come in here and we're first going to talk about some of the DOM scripting properties and methods. From there, we look at not a real long, but a FAQ, or frequently asked questions application, that uses the document object model. All right. The next section, how to script forms and controls, we're going to go over this, but that said, much of that stuff you guys have already had. In other words, you know what forms are. You know what a text box is, what a text area is. You know how to use select and option. We did that with the states, where we had a list of all 50 states. All right. You know what radio buttons and check boxes are. But now we're going to be talking about how to sit there and do some programmatic manipulation with these. Then we look at another application, this registration or register application. All right. And then finally, the chapter ends with, as you can see, how to modify the DOM. And notice what it says there: create, add, replace, and delete. All right. So that's a lot of the stuff I just mentioned as far as these CRUD operations: create, update, and delete type of things. All right. So let's just jump right into it. And again, some of the stuff that's in here, they talk about it, and you can go online and find a lot of this stuff. I mean, if you're either confused or you want to read more, you can go and bring up the entire DOM core specification. I believe it was written by the W3C. All right. Now, it says Figure 6.1 presents some of the concepts that you should understand. Well, when we look at this, what they're saying is if we come up and create something that looks like this, there really shouldn't be anything on the screen right here. Let's just move it up. So there's really nothing on the screen up till this point in that HTML that shouldn't really surprise you. Now, you might look at that span that's down at the bottom. That will be something new, but we've looked a little bit at spans before. If you remember on your test, one of the things that you were told on the test was that on the contact page that you should do validation. And with that validation, I said for now, it was totally fine for you to just put in alerts. Now, maybe you did that, maybe you did something else, but just so you see this, what we're going to be getting into then, let's see there, is this. This that you see right there, that is done using a span. Originally, when you start writing the program, what'll happen is these two messages that you see will not be shown, but two asterisks will be there in red, meaning that those are both required fields. If you leave them off, the asterisk will change from being an asterisk to what you see here. All right. If you put in a valid number for miles driven, if you put in a valid number for gallons of gas used, then both of these will disappear and nothing will show there. And that's kind of the way that we're going to end up using spans, just so you have an idea of what I'm getting to here. All right, so you create this, and what gets built for you is this. All right, this is an example of a document object model. Now, you don't actually see this, but the point is that virtually anything that you see there, whether it's blue or whether it's green, anything that you see there, you can now manipulate. All right. And you'll also notice, we may have talked about this, I'm going to mention it again anyway, that the parent or root node is HTML. And HTML has two children. It has a head and it has a body. The head has one child, which is the title. The title has one child, which is text. The body has two children, an H1 and a form. The H1 has one child, which is text. The form has three children, all right, a label, an input, and a span, and the label and the span each have text, all right? But anything that you see in there, anything, is manipulatable, if that's a word, using document object model and document object model methods. Now, for you to actually be able to go in and do that manipulation, what most people do is anything that they want to manipulate programmatically, they give it an ID. Is it mandatory that you do that? No, but that's usually what's going to be done. So if we go back up here, notice the form has an ID. This input here has an ID. This span here has an ID. Those are probably going to be the ones that you are going to most likely want to be able to manipulate programmatically. Hence, they each have an ID. All right. Now, when you look in here, it says DOM nodes that you commonly use. Well, document, the root node. Okay. It says the root node of the DOM, it can have only one element node as a child node. That's way up higher. These things you see in here in blue, they're all elements. And an element can have a child, which is another element, as you can see. An element can have a child, which is text. And an element can be known what's known as a leaf element, meaning like this one here, it has nothing underneath it. All right. And there's actually, I don't want to confuse you, but there's more DOM nodes that are being shown here. All right. And we're just concentrating on the ones you're going to need to worry about. ETR, as it says, is an attribute of an element. You say, I don't know what that means. Yeah, you do. So for instance, email form is the attribute for the ID element. You know, and it's both for the ID and for the name. All right. You'll notice that for the input here, email address, again, is the element for ID. Text is the element for type, etc. All right. So as it says there, and I don't expect this to totally make sense, but look at it this way, that the DOM is something that gets created for you. You don't see it, but it's something that you can use to manipulate the web page dynamically. And if you look at it that way, then hopefully at least it'll make some sense. So they define it here, and it's referred to as the DOM more often than the document object model, as being a hierarchical collection of nodes. All right. And as it says there, the DOM for a web page is built as the page is loaded by the browser. You can modify anything on there by modifying the DOM. Notice when the DOM changes, the browser displays the results of the page. All right. And again, this DOM core specification is where all this different stuff that's in here is, for lack of better words, pretty much defined. So they've got some concepts that are in here. I just didn't want to go into this in too much depth of coverage and confuse people. But if you want to know more about element nodes, attribute nodes, etc., all right, then you can take a look at what's in here. They also mentioned, and I started saying it, but not in a lot of depth. So when we looked at that picture, HTML was the parent, and head and body were the children. Head and body, since they were on the same level, they were siblings. All right. And head had underneath it, for example, title. Title is a descendant of both head and of, for example. All right. That's the kind of stuff that they're talking about in here. Some books go really into this stuff, so much so that it gets to be very confusing. All right. And other books, I probably don't give it enough coverage. My hope is that you're getting enough in here that at least it makes some sense to you. And again, we will go over some of the exercises at the end of chapter 6 and at the end of chapter 7, which I hope will help in your understanding of this. All right. So it says next, the table on the next page, which I'm going to turn to in just a moment, describes 7 of the most useful properties of working with nodes. Okay. So when you take a look in here, and I'm not going to read any of these to you, but these are things that you can manipulate. Now, you'll notice in here that none of these talk about ID like I mentioned, right? None of these talk about ID because there are ways to manipulate the DOM that even if you don't use an ID, you can still manipulate. All right. So if you know where you are in the document object model, all right, then as an example, if I'm at the HTML level, my first child that's in there is going to be head. My last child that's in there is going to be body, etc. So they're showing you some of this stuff. All right. And again, please don't think, oh, man, do I have to memorize this? No, not at all. But again, this is a way for you to really bring interactivity into a web page more than anything else. All right. So they give you some examples in here. All right. Now, just so you know, because you're going to see this in just a couple minutes, that they mentioned here that this second example uses query selector. All right. When you use query selector, that was one of the things that we had been using when we had that $ and we were using the alias. Query selector allows you to select almost anything. So for instance, if I do a query selector and I put inside of here P for paragraph, it's going to find the first paragraph on the page. Not only is there a query selector, and again, sorry if this is confusing, but there is a query selector all, which will find all paragraphs on a page. All right. Now, what you're going to also notice in just a couple minutes is not only is there a query selector, but there's also a thing that's called get element by ID. And that's one of the reasons that you use IDs on anything that you want to manipulate programmatically. Remember that on any one page, the IDs must be unique. In other words, you can't have the same ID. All right. So what if you do want that? What about classes? Well, not only is there a query selector and a query selector all and a get element by ID, but there are 2 other ones that we'll look at in just a moment. One is called get element by class name. So it would grab everything that had a certain class. And another one is called get element by tag name, which is a lot like query selector. Now, good, bad, or indifferent, there are different ways that you can do the same thing. And they give you a bunch of examples in here. All right. It says this third example shows two ways to get a span element's text. So if we look at the third example, 1, 2, 3, right here, what they're saying is these are different ways basically of grabbing the same thing. All right. And I know that I've mentioned this to you before. I would recommend looking at this, of course, reading the chapter. But as we start to go through these, find one. If there's 4 ways of doing something, find one that seems to make the most sense to you and use that one. All right. It's not that you have to use all 4 ways of doing something. Okay. So again, as we go through there, hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. As it says here, the interface describes the properties for an object. When DOM scripting, you often use the properties of the node interface. That virtually everything that's on your page is going to be a node. All right. So when we looked back at this just a moment ago, these are all nodes. All right. And why is that important? Because you use nodes when you are working with the DOM. All right. Now, when you look in here, it says the first table summarizes two methods. Well, these are the ones I already mentioned to you. The first is query selector. And notice it returns the first element that matches whatever you pass to it. So if I come in here and I pass in an A tag, all right, it's going to find the first A tag that exists on the page. On the other hand, if I do a query selector all and I pass it an A tag, it's going to return all of the A tags that are on the page. All right, and they do show you some examples in here of using it. So notice it's a query selector all, and they're calling that links because if there's only one link on a page, of course, there's only one to find. But if there are multiple links on a page, it will find all of them. Now, what is cool about this? Right here, it's really kind of, you probably don't get it, so to speak, yet. But as an example, let's say that I've got a web page. And on that web page, all right, I've got a, I'm just making this all up off the top of my head. But when you come to a web page, there's a form on there. All right. And on that form, it tells you to enter in your 3 favorite colors. All right. Like I said, I'm making this up. So you go in there and you put in blue, red, green. Okay. So now what you can do is you can take that information that you just got from the user and you can literally on the fly, you can build an unordered list or an ordered list with those things that are in there. Now that by itself may not sound like much, but again, think about how you can use that to help maximize the user experience. What you could do if you wanted to is when a user comes onto your page, as an example, you could say, hey, we want you to set the background color for the page. And you could give them some choices, or you could just give them that color picker and let them pick the color they wanted. Then you could say, and what color would you like for the text on the page? So just as an example, these are things that you can end up doing dynamically. All right, and that's what I'm trying to get across to you. All right. So that's the query selector to get just the first one it finds. That's a query selector all to get all of them. All right, let's jump back again. So as it says, okay, it says the second method in the first table returns an array of all of them. All right. Now, it says note that if you don't need to refer to the UL elements elsewhere in your code, you don't need to store it, etc. So what they're doing here is, again, they are building this thing on the fly. All right. And although that may not sound like much, it's kind of, I think at least, it's kind of cool somebody can be on your web page. You can ask them information or give them a place where they can, if they want to, enter information, and then you can customize their web page experience using what they entered. All right. The second table, as it mentions on the bottom of this page, says summarizes some of the methods that you can use to work with different attributes. All right. So when we look over here, we can say, does something have an attribute? All right. There are things in here that don't have attributes. Okay. For instance, a BR tag, line break, doesn't have an attribute. All right. An HR tag doesn't typically have an attribute, but you can give an HR, the horizontal rule. You can give it an attribute if you want. For instance, if by default, if you make an HR tag, it stretches across 100% the width of the screen. But you can go in there and you can give an attribute of width. And if you only want it to be 50% of the screen, you can do that. So that's where you could, if you wanted to, and that's not a great example, but it has attribute and the get attribute, or you could use the set attribute in there. All right. Or as it says, you could remove all attributes. So when you look at this, again, we're talking about operations where you're either able to create something or remove something. All right. On the bottom of the page here, they mentioned the methods of the document and element interfaces return objects that represent HTML elements. And what an object is, I mean, we're all objects, as an example. All right. And in a later chapter, they're going to talk about object-oriented programming. But each one of us is a human object. And we all have different properties. We all have eye color, hair color, height, weight, etc. And they're not the same for any of us. And we all have methods, which are behaviors that we can do. We all eat, we all sleep, we all drink, but we sleep different amounts, we eat different things, we drink different things, etc. All right. And they mentioned there that the methods of this element interface let you work with the attributes. All right. Says the properties and methods we've looked at so far are part of what's referred to as the DOM core specification. All right, which you can use, but there's something that supposedly makes it easier to work with elements, which is called the DOM HTML specification. What does that mean? That means you can use either one of these. All right. Or you can use them in conjunction or in combination with one another. All right. So let's take a look at some of the examples that are in here. Okay. First of all, notice, again, if you go out to the W3C link that's shown at the top of the page here, all right, if you go up to that link, you can find the entire DOM HTML specification. I will tell you, this isn't funny. I don't think it's not meant to be funny. It's a really dry read. Reading anything by the W3, which is the World Wide Web Consortium, it's kind of boring. All right, but there's some really good stuff in there. All right. So some of the properties that are available in there, you can see the elements. All right, the element name, the associated property, and then the different attributes. All right. Now, what does that mean? What does that have to do with anything? Let's look at the examples. All right. So they're showing here says how to get and set an image tag using the DOM core. So notice the first thing you have to do is you have to create a variable that's going to hold the image. All right. Then we can come in here and we can display the source of it. Or if we want to, we can set the source. Remember, anytime you use get, it's referred to as an accessor. It's like if I say, if I ask a math question, if I say, how much is 10 plus 10? And you raise your hand and you say 20, you're not doing a set, you're doing a get. You're giving me information. All right. On the other hand, if I told you to create your own math problem, you'd kind of be setting something. All right. But you'll notice when you look at the two of these, basically what you end up eliminating is the first step that you see up above in the DOM core. And you end up taking what is in there and simplifying it. So the bottom line is this: most people, if you give them the choice of using the DOM HTML spec or the DOM core spec, they're going to use the DOM HTML spec because typically it's less work. All right. But they show you in here a whole bunch of examples. And I will tell you that if what I'm saying right now makes very little sense, that's actually to be expected until you start working with this. All right. Now, I want to give you an example of something here. I'm not going to bring it up. Or what we had when we did that, I think it was for the pretest where we did the BMI problem. Okay. And if you remember that BMI, what did we have there? We had two labels, one for height, one for weight, and each one had a text box. Then underneath that, we had a couple buttons, one that would basically get calculate the BMI, and one that would kind of clear everything out. Then down below that, we had two more labels and two more text boxes. And those labels said BMI, and that's where the BMI was shown in the text box, and status. And then in the text box, all right, it was shown either underweight, optimal weight, overweight, or obese. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, we were being very regimented when we were doing that. In other words, we set up everything for that. What we could do, what we could do or could have done is rather than have that those two text boxes on the bottom with the BMI and the status and those two labels, we could have made a div on the screen and we could have created any kind of elements we wanted in there. We could have still used labels, etc. Or we could have just came in there and just written a bunch of text inside of a div. So the div would have nothing in it until we had finished and completed figuring out the BMI and figuring out the status. Then we could have written to that div what the BMI was and what the status was. All right. The difference is, okay, that while we were calculating that stuff, we wouldn't have been using some of our screen to hold two different labels and two different text boxes. The reason that that becomes important is, what the amount of screen that you have is paramount. It's really important. And if you're using a device like a phone, if you can hide some stuff until you're better off because you don't have that much real estate on the phone anyway. All right. Okay. So they give a bunch of examples in here of getting and setting. But again, the idea is this: when you're doing a get, all right, whatever it is you're looking at over here is on the right-hand side of an equal sign. When you're doing a set, whatever you want to deal with is on the left-hand side of an equal sign. All right. So if I create a variable that's called X, and I set X equal to 10 plus 10, all right, then that is a setter on X. Then if later on I want to assign X to Y and I say Y equal X, now I'm doing a get operation, not a set operation. I'm getting the value and I'm setting a different value. So what they're saying here is, if you look on the bottom of the page, the HTML spec is designed to make it easier to work with whatever we're doing here. All right. And this thing about it interfaces and inherits, it's just that it has shortcuts. All right, so you can do the same thing that you were doing using the core spec. You can do the same thing with the HTML spec, but typically with less code. All right, if you think of it that way, that's probably the best way to look at it. All right. So it says here in the preceding figures, you learn two ways you can work with a class attribute of an element. You can use a set attribute to set something and a remove element to get rid of it. All right, it says second, you can use the class name from the HTML spec. So again, there's multiple ways of doing this. All right, so if we take a look on here, this is some other stuff that you can work with in here. The good news is what's going to typically end up happening, not always, but what is typically going to end up happening is you're going to use, it's kind of the 80-20 rule. You learn 20% of the stuff pretty well that you use 80% of the time. All right. And for the rest of it, it's not so much that you use it once in a blue moon. Don't use it often. And when you do use it, you just go online to check out how to use it. All right. So they talk in here about a class list. Notice what it says. It contains the class names. All right. And it provides properties and methods for working with them. We'll look at that in a second. All right. Some of the stuff that's in here, notice length, the number of class names in the class attribute, value, the class names in the class attribute. Now, again, probably makes very little sense. And then they show some of these methods. So if we look here, if we've got this, H2 class equal first, welcome to our website. Okay. All right. Notice what we've done there is we've given the H2 element a class. Okay. Then we're querying right here and we're taking that class first and we're assigning it over here to this, something that's called HTG2. Why would you want to do that? Well, notice what they're doing here. All right. This is almost breaking the rules that we talked about earlier. Earlier in the semester, what we talked about, all right, what we talked about was the fact, the separation of concerns, that your HTML should be in .html files, your CSS should be in .css files, and your JavaScript should be in .js files. And the CSS should be in its own folder. The JS should be in its own folder. That's what we've been doing all semester. All right. But when you're doing that, so one of the things that you might want to be able to do, and this is an example of what I mentioned before, you could come in there and you could say under this welcome to our website, if you had gone in and earlier asked the user, what's your favorite color? And they said blue, you could come in then and programmatically, all right, come in here and add blue in there to that color. Now, is that a big thing? It may not sound like a big thing. But again, the idea is you are trying to come in here and not only maximize the user experience, but you want to make it as easy. You know, we've talked about this before, that if somebody comes onto your website, if you're selling a service or a product, and you've gotten somebody to come onto your website, you don't want them to leave. In other words, I mean, I don't mean ever, but you don't want them to leave until they have either purchased your service or purchased your product. So we're talking about doing in here is to try to make it as simple for them to do things as possible. And what we're getting to on this page and on some of the previous pages is, again, how to sit there and interactively be able to change things as the program is running. And that's what they're showing you in here. All right. And this, if it doesn't make a lot of sense, all right, this is one way of doing it. when we get into talking about jQuery starting next week, you'll see kind of at least another way of doing it. You'll notice here that you've got a toggle, all right? And that may make absolutely no sense, all right? But when you start to work with toggles, it's like a light switch. You can turn the light switch on, you can turn the light switch off, or like a shade, which is pulled up or pulled down. Well, you can set a whole bunch of stuff programmatically and toggle it between being turned on and turned off, for example. All right. And that's kind of what we're starting to get to here. All right. Like I said, there's no great way. There is no great way to attack this. All right. And the author gave you a whole bunch of stuff in here. All right. That some of it may have made sense. Some of it maybe made a lot of sense. Some of it maybe made a little bit of sense. And some of it you might be just scratching your head. So let's take a look at this FAQ application that's in here. All right. It says now you'll see how the properties and methods of the node, document, and element interfaces are used in an application. This is an FAQ, or frequently asked questions application. So when you look at it, this is it right here. All right. You'll notice that if you go, there are plus signs here. This was originally a plus sign where it says, what is jQuery? That was black, just like this. When you click the plus sign, the color changes from black to blue to show that it is active, and it opens up or answers the question down below. Now, with some of these FAQs, only one can be open at a time. So in other words, if I were to click this plus sign, then this one would automatically close. It would go back to a plus sign and it would go back to being black. And then this would become a minus sign. This would become blue, and you'd get the answer underneath here. Sometimes with frequently asked questions, you're able to have as many open as you want. It depends on how it has been programmed. All right. And even whether it does or does not seem like it, this example that you see on your screen right here is almost as simple as it gets. All right. So if we go back, this is the same explanation I just gave you. So I don't want to read it again. All right. So how is this set up? Pretty simply, believe it or not. It says in the HTML, you can see that each question is coded in an anchor element within an H2 element. And each H2 element is followed by a div which contains the answer. What does that mean? That means that this is coded as an anchor, basically as an H2, but an anchor element. And this is put in there as a div that holds the answer. And again, I'm not saying that's the best way of doing it. I'm not saying that's the right way of doing it. I'm saying that's how they did it. The href elements are coded where, as far as telling where it goes, is just a pound sign. The pound sign means don't go anywhere. All right. As it says, because these A elements are coded within the H2, you can tab from one to the other. And again, when you click on it, it makes it active. Right. And another important thing, as it says there, it says when the user tabs to a heading and presses enter, it's like you clicked on it. That makes it easier because, as it says here, there are a lot of people out there who are motor impaired, that doing things like working with a mouse is very much a chore for them if they're able to do it at all. All right. The HTML, as it says, includes an external CSS style sheet and an external JavaScript file, which we'll look at both of those in just a second. But looking in here, because this is all of the HTML, so let's take it from the top. You'll notice we've got a main tag, starts at the top, ends at the bottom. All right. And we've given it an ID. So we are able to collectively if we want to, have to, need to apply CSS, all right, to that ID. Then up here where it says jQuery facts, you'll notice that there is nothing. There's no ID, there's no nothing, because that's just this right here, just a heading. All right. Then what you'll notice is we've got a series of H2 tags. There's 3 of them. Each H2 tag has as its contents an A tag, which goes nowhere. All right. So again, the what is jQuery, the why use jQuery, and which is harder to learn, jQuery or JavaScript. That's this and this and this. And each one of these, after the H2, has a div, and the div has a paragraph in it. All right. Now you might look at this and say, okay, I kind of get that. All right. But when we look in here, well, we don't have a whole heck of a lot of IDs, and we don't. We've got an ID right here, and unless I'm missing something, that's really the only one we have. All right. But one thing, remember, that we can do if we want to, one thing that we can do is we can go and say, hey, we can put div in there or H2 in there into our CSS and handle all divs or all H2s the same way at the same time if we want to. All right. Now it's not showing up here, but there would be a head element up here as well, and that would be bringing in our CSS file, which we'll look at in a moment. Then at the bottom, we've got our script tag, which brings in our JavaScript file. So let's look at the CSS. All right, there's not a lot. It's right here. All A tags by default, an A tag is black and not underlined. All right. Notice when it gets the focus, so meaning you either clicked on it or you're hovering over it, it changes then. All right, so it changes from, all right, it changes from black to blue. All right. H2, the cursor pointer just means that by default, your cursor looks like this. Hopefully you can see mine moving around, but it looks like an arrow. This says make it look like a finger. All right. And the background for each H2 by default will be a plus sign. So when you start this up, every single one of these should be a plus sign right there. Okay. There's also a minus sign. And you'll notice that the divs by default do not display. They're all hidden. When you say display none, that doesn't mean that they're not there. It means they're not showing. And when they are there, you're doing a display block, which just basically means show us the entire paragraph. All right. Now, that's fine. But now what we're doing really kind of for the first time here is when you look at the JavaScript, we are now coming in here and we are manipulating those H2 tags and those divs with the paragraphs programmatically. All right. So if we look at the top part there that says const toggle equals EVT, arrow function, etc. Notice the first thing it says. All right. It says here, get whichever one. The current target is the one you just clicked. All right. Then it says, get the H2's sibling. All right. What's its sibling? Well, again, oops, sorry. If we go back and we look at this, if that's the H2, there's its sibling. If that's the H2, there's its sibling. If that's the H2, there's its sibling. All right. So we're seeing basically, is it a plus sign or is it a minus sign? Well, we just clicked on it, so we want to change it. So if we did click on it and it was a plus sign, okay, make it a minus sign. But notice we're toggling. So it should go back to a plus sign otherwise. And by default, if we just clicked on it, the plus becomes a minus and the div is open, which should show us the code. All right. And then notice there's a prevent default because by default, remember that H2 is set up to an anchor tag and it won't go anywhere, but we don't want it to do anything. So that EVT that you see in there, that EVT that you see is the event. It's you clicking on any one of those H2 elements, and that's what's happening. All right. So we go down below that, then notice what's down here. Document.add event listener. Well, we've done that before where we've added an event listener. All right. And what are we doing? Well, notice in here, it's a document.query selector all. All right. And as it says, that's grabbing each one of the H2 tags. Okay. Then we are attaching an event listener for a click, okay, to each one of them, which means that when we click on any one of these, this is what we're going to want to have happen. And then we make sure that when we start running the program, the focus is on the first one. Okay, so it's as though not that we clicked on it, but that our mouse is hovering over it. Now, you can look at the stuff that's here, and maybe they don't explain it exactly the way that I did. If you don't like my explanation, please take a read over the CSS here and the JavaScript that's right there. I don't think you're going to find anything different, but you might find a little bit better explanation than the one I'm giving you. But this is really, when you think about it, this is the first time, for lack of better words, that we're kind of bringing everything together. And what I mean is, you have worked with HTML, you have worked with CSS, you have worked with those two together. All right. You have worked with JavaScript so much where we were using JavaScript to be able to manipulate either the HTML or the CSS. And that's what we're getting into right now. All right. So like I said, hopefully that makes at least a little bit of sense to you. All right. Let's start on this. I'll go till 5 after, and then we'll take a break. All right. So you know what a form is. No big surprise there. Forms consist of controls. As it says, the controls accept user entries. That accept entries are known as form fields. So what they get to here, and this is an important topic. I don't want to read to you, but when you come here and you do this, and you got all this stuff that's in here, I want to make sure you understand what's going on here. First of all, you've got the form tag. This is how you will refer to that form tag in your client-side code. So your client-side JavaScript or your client-side CSS will use this right there. This is how you refer to it in server-side code. So for next semester, those of you who will be working in the AWD1111 database-driven website development, you'll very rarely probably use ID. You'll mainly be using the name, okay? And this says when you click the submit button, which is our join our list, what we want to do is we want you to grab all of that information and we want you to send it over to a server file or a file on the server called join.php. And the way we want you to do that is using get, which means that that information that we send over the internet will be sent in what's called a query string. So it'll look like this. It says we want to call join.php, And the query string is actually everything after the question mark. So it says the email address that we're providing is grace@yahoo.com, and the first name we're providing is Grace. You can see that's where we got those from. On the other hand, instead of saying method equal get here, we had said method equal post. You would not see this stuff in a query string, because when you use the post method, it takes that stuff that you are putting in there and it doesn't add it in a query string. It adds it in the hypertext transfer protocol or HTTP header. So it's a little bit more secure. So if you had something like a password in there or a credit card number, you wouldn't be saying there method equal get, because it would show it where other people could conceivably see it. You would use post. So again, they explain here the name, the action, and the method. All right. I believe that the other stuff that they talked about in here, this is all stuff basically, we've either just did talk about with a get, all right, or we have talked about before. All right. So you can take a look at that. They do mention typically the form again will be validated on the client side, then sent over and validated again on the server side. So, not new here. Form contains controls or fields. Those are some of them. You have worked with them before. When you click a submit button, as it says, the form data is sent to the server. That's actually not exactly true. Typically, what's going to happen is when you click on the submit button, all right, the form will be validated. And if all of the form fields are valid, then the form is sent to the server as part of an HTTP request. On the other hand, if you have errors, then it typically won't be. When you click on a reset button, as it says, the form goes back to its default values. So for instance, the best example of that I can give you, and we've talked about this before, is that if I set the state, if I don't give it a default state, so it just says, if I got a drop down list of states and on the top, my selection 0 says select the state, all right, then that will be what happens with a reset button. On the other hand, if I set the default state to MO, then when I click reset, then it'll be set to MO. All right. Again, when the form is submitted to the server for processing, the data in the controls is sent along with the request. When you use a get, the URL, as it says, is followed by a question mark and the query string. When you use a post, that data is instead hidden. Data validation, as mentioned, refers to checking data by a form to make sure it's valid. All right. And if it's not allowing it to be sent to the server. And that goes into the last bullet here, which says to save round trips, you usually do at least some validation on the client. All right. Now, if on the client, if you have 8 fields, first name, last name, address, city, state, zip, uh, cell phone number, and email address, the only fields that get validated are those fields either you provided HTML validation for, like if you said type equals email, it'll make sure that the email is at least set up correctly. But if you don't put anything else in there, there's no other validation that's done. So typically for fields that you want required, you will put in some validation. And that's what they're talking about. All right. Again, most of the stuff that's in here, we've already had. All right. Now, when they talk about value that's in there, notice the content of the value attribute for the entered text or selected option. So the value, if we had a drop down list of states and you selected Missouri, would be either Missouri or MO. All right. And the value, if you've got a text box, it'll be whatever value you put in there. All right. So they show you some examples. And again, they don't exactly agree with what I told you, but typically the name value, not always, but almost always, this will be used for server side. This will be used for client. That's almost always the way that it's going to work. And they're also almost always going to be given the same name. Are there exceptions? You bet there are, especially if you've got a drop down list. All right. You might name the this drop down, or state list, and the IDs there might be 50 of them, one for each state type of an idea. All right. So they show you how they're setting it up here. And then down here, they're showing how you can use JavaScript to get the code out of there. The good news is these examples that you see right here, these are what we had used previously. All right. When we did the guessing game and when we did the BMI, that's pretty much the way we did it there. So there's not a lot right there, at least, that's new. All right. So as it says, typically the name and IDs are going to be set to the same value. All right. After you use it, the value property says you can use the length if you want. All right, to get the number of characters. There's also like a max length and a min length. So for instance, I might set the max length for a state. If I'm using just abbreviations, I might set the max length to 2. All right, something like that. As it says, setting the value of a text box or text area, when you set it, it's on the left-hand side of an equal sign. So you are changing its value. So here we're clearing its value out, for example. All right. I'll tell you what, it is 9:06. Let's take 10 minutes, come back at 9:16. We'll pick it up right here on how to script radio buttons and checkbox objects. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. 9:17 just changed. All right, it is 9:17, so I'm going to start back up. The next thing they discuss in here is all about radio buttons and checkboxes. Now, we have talked about these before, so I don't think there's really a whole heck of a lot. They do mention two of the properties for these. The value property has the contents of the attribute, and then there's a checked property, which is Boolean, which means that if either the checkbox is checked or the radio button has been selected, that checked is set to true, otherwise it's false. You should also remember that radio buttons are for what are referred to as mutually exclusive choices, so that only one radio button that's in a group can be selected, whereas checkboxes are for non-mutually exclusive choices. So if you've got three radio buttons that are in a group, that let's say that you have gender and you've got male, female, or other, all right, then typically, quite often what people will do is they will default one to be checked. All right, if you know you've got more females, you'd probably go and default it to female, etc. All right. On the other hand, when you've got checkboxes and you put in something in there like best way to contact you, all right, and you've got like checkboxes with text, email, phone call, USPS mail, etc. You can select none of them, any one, any two, any three, or all four. All right. So again, there's not like that. That should really be a new kind of concept in there. All right. But again, giving them names and IDs and then checking the checked value. All right. And again, also setting it. So if I wanted to turn all of these off, I could just set all of them to false. Now, we've talked about this before, but just kind of to review, as they say here on the bottom of the page, all radio buttons in a group must have the same name, but must have a different ID. So for instance, in the radio button example that I gave you with male, female, and other, all right, the name property for all three of those would be gender. However, be male, or the ID would be female, or the ID would be other. All right, if you don't do it like that, you're not going to be able to make them mutually exclusive. Checkboxes, as it says, are not treated as a group. All right, that's why the name and the ID is going to be set to the same value. All right, I think the other stuff that's in there we've already talked about before. So, all right. How to use methods and events for forms and controls. Well, if we look in here, the two methods, as it says, that are commonly used for forms are the submit and the reset. All right. With the submit, as soon as you hit, a submit button, the submit event runs, unless you have that EVT dot prevent default. All right. So it's going to attempt to take what you did and submit it to the server. Even if you have given it a file to submit to the server and that file doesn't exist, you'll get an error, but it will still attempt to do the submission. If you have not told it to go anywhere specifically, it'll typically still show you the query string contents on the top of the screen if it was done through a get. All right. Now with controls, as it says, the focus, we've used this before. All right. And that basically is making that the active control, or putting the mouse in that text box or whatever it is that happens to be. When you go from one control to the other, all right, two events happen. I think we talked about this before. So if I'm going, for example, from a first name to a last name. So in the first name, I type Jeff in there. And let's say that I've set it up with, I can tab from field to field. So I put Jeff in the first name, boom, I hit the tab key. Two events occur. A blur event happens on the first name, and then a focus event happens on the last name. And the reason that becomes important is especially in those cases where you've got fields that are required. All right. If somebody goes into a field that's required to put anything in there, you can actually set it up that you can check that when the blur event happens, that if there's nothing in there, you can reset the focus right back to the same field, as an example. Also, with this select, what that does is it takes basically it's as though you clicked on the field to highlight it. Typically, it'll make everything in there blue. All right. So it says here common control events, but again, by no means are these all of your different events. All right. So by now you should at least be comfortable with focus, with blur, with click, with double click. All right. And now we're starting to look at things like change and select. And again, there are going to be examples of all of these in here. Now they mentioned on the bottom of the page here, input elements with a type attribute set to submit or reset, automatically submit or reset a form. Says, however, you can also use JavaScript, has its own submit method and its own reset method. All right. So what they do, there's about 15 pages left in the chapter, is they're first going to talk about this registration and a register application. Then they're going to talk about how we can make modifications and then show you a modified form of this application. All right. So this is the registration application here. It's a little more complex than anything we've seen before. So when you look on here, you'll notice, all right, you will notice that there are 5 different things that technically are being expected here. It's expecting an email, it's expecting a phone number, it's expecting a country, it's expecting a way of contacting you, and it's expecting, in this case, that you have checked the button that says terms of service. So what's going to happen is when you click register, it's going to automatically check those fields. If there is something that's put in here, it won't give you that message. It'll just go on and check this one. If there's something that's been put in here, it'll message, it'll just go on to the next one. If this has a country, so if this one doesn't say select a country, if it's got a country selected, it won't give you that message, and it'll go on to the next one. What most people tend to do on their forms is that if you've got a group of radio buttons, they set one of them as being checked. That way, one thing is checked. All right. The user can always check a different one, but one is checked. And in this one, you check to make sure, because what we're saying is it's mandatory once you click register that before you go on that you've checked this. All right. So that's what this particular example is about. All right. I pretty much just went over this with you right now. All right. And you'll notice it says if an entry is required, a red asterisk is displayed by the side of the control. Well, there are no red asterisks here. Why? Because we've already clicked the register button. If we clicked reset, all right, then everything that was not set by default that is required would then have a red asterisk next to it. That's what the author is saying here. All right. So it says here, part 1 shows some of the HTML. You can see the form uses a get to submit the values to a page named register account. All right, it says in practice, though, you would use post because it's more secure. Well, when we look here, then the point is, what you have to start saying is, okay, if we keep this as a get and this information gets out, is there anything in here that would be considered privileged? And there may be. It may not look like it here, but sometimes when you go and register someplace on a site, they'll say in here, when they, under their terms of service, if you look at it, it'll say in there that they reserve the right to sell your email to different places or let other people see it, etc. All right. I mean, there have been times I have not accepted a term of service because I've actually looked through them. And then you get on all these different lists and you start getting emails for all sorts of stuff you don't care about. Now, after some of the controls, you can see span elements. Those are the ones where you're going to have the asterisk. So those are going to be your required fields. All right. And we'll want the messages to display in red. The asterisks will be in red also. It doesn't look like they're bold here. They could be, but I oftentimes bold mine as well. So when we look in here, you'll notice that what? Well, there's an asterisk. So there's the first name. There's another asterisk. There's for the last name. There's an asterisk for the country. And for the terms of service, it doesn't look like there is one in there. And for the register, or the contact me rather, there's not one. And for the terms of service, there's not one. So these three fields are required. So again, when the program starts up, there should be a red asterisk here and here and here. All right. Next, they go through the JavaScript. Notice it says there it consists of 4 functions, starting with that $ function. So what is that? You already know what this is. You will also now have a better idea of what query selector is, because we talked about that earlier in the chapter. All right. So when we start to look through this, I like to typically go down to the bottom first. Say, okay, there's my event listener for when the content is loaded. And it says here that when I click the register button, I want to call process entries. When I click the reset button, I want to call reset form. And when the program starts, I want the email address to have the focus. Then I can start working my way back up. Usually the reset, the clear is the easiest. And you can see what they're doing there is they're setting back those asterisks to the email, to the phone, to the country, and to the terms. All right. And then setting the focus. Then up here, what are they doing? Well, they're basically checking everything. Notice this is valid. It's assuming that it's true. If you put nothing in there, that asterisk changes to this field is required, and is valid is now false. All right. Otherwise, as it says, the one for the email is going to be blank. All right. We do the same thing for the phone, for the country, or the terms. And then only if all of our validity checks passed. So if there is something in the country, if there is something in the phone, if there is something, or I guess in the email, in the phone, in the country, and the terms were checked, only then do you submit the form. Now, are they doing a great job of validating here? No. For instance, when you look here for phone, all right, all it's saying is if it's empty, and I think we've talked about this before, but just on the off chance we have not, if it's a text field like this, it really should be phone.value.trim, which trims any leading or trailing blanks. You really should do that. It's just a good idea. It cleans up, all right, cleans the thing up a little bit. All right, so again, only if all of our validation check passed do we actually submit the form. All right. Now they're going to talk about how to modify the DOM, and then, because we got about 10 pages left in the chapter, then I believe they're going to go back to the same one we just looked at, this registration one, and talk about how to work with it with a DOM. All right. So the reason that this is important is look at this first sentence. JavaScript lets you add nodes to and replace nodes in the DOM. allows you to delete existing nodes in the DOM. Those are those operations that I talked about earlier in the chapter. All right. Again, then it says we'll see a different version of the register app that allows us to do some of this. All right. So when we look over here, I'll come back to this in a moment, but you'll notice these are the main methods that we're going to use. These, of course, are not the only methods. All right. So we can create elements. What's the difference between an element and a text node? An element would be a thing like a paragraph. A text node would be the text in the paragraph. All right. And then notice there are other methods that we can use with the node interface. Append child, which will add something appended onto the end of something that already exists. Insert before, which says find something on a page and right before that thing that you found, insert something new. Replace, which as it says there, allows you to do a modification. And notice you pass in with the insert before and the replace child, you pass in a new and an existing. A remove child, which allows you to basically remove something. All right. And that, notice the difference. It says the first remove child, it says removes the specified child node from a parent node, whereas remove itself physically removes the actual node itself. All right. So if we back up and we look at this, it says the first table presents two more methods of the document interface. Create elements creates a new HTML element based on the name that it receives. Create text node creates a new DOM text node property and assigns the string it receives to it. All right. Then we've got, again, append child. As it says, it receives a DOM node and adds it as a child of the parent node. Replace child receives a new node and an existing node, and rather than inserting it, it's like doing a search and replace. All right. And then finally, again, the last two allow you to remove nodes. Notice the remove child removes it, the child node that's passed to it from the parent. The remove just removes the node that called the method. All right. We'll see these in a little more depth and breadth of coverage when we go through some examples in a little bit and next week. All right. Then there's just a bunch of examples. So you'll notice in the example here how they added middle paragraph where it said add to DOM. Well, that would be probably in there you'd use one way of doing it would be using an insert before, and you'd want to do an insert before where currently last paragraph is. All right. And they're showing you how you can do this in here. They're literally coming in and creating a new paragraph element. Then they are adding text to that. Then they're doing an appending here. All right. And then an insert before. So it's not like this is all that easy to do. All right. I mean, there's a few different steps that you've got to go through, a few different hoops you've got to jump through, however you want to look at it, in order to get all this to work. All right. So the chapter ends here with them updating this register application. So notice what's different here. Now they are summarizing the error messages at the top of the page. This is typically called an error summary section. Now, the reason that sometimes at least this works better than this is if this is pretty wide already and you've got a big message, it may go off the screen and it may be where it wraps and it looks kind of ugly, where a lot of people like to do it like this. All right. They put it in a box now. You can see just at a glance that there are 4 errors in here. You don't have to worry. It has not changed your interface. All right. But you can also see where those asterisks were, meaning those were the four the four required fields. And again, since we already set contact me to text by default by setting the checked property, one of the contact me will always be set. The reason that this kind of becomes important is when you start to go through and you start to set up your own error handling. For example, this semester, one of the things that we've done in the ASP.NET class, which is the AWD1115 database-driven website development 2 class, in there, we have actually set some of these things up where you've got an error summary section. All right. As it says, it's also going to give the style rule. All right. Notice it adds a red border. It sets the font color to red. It adds padding. All right. It adds aesthetic things to change it. All right. It says next, it shows the updated JavaScript, and they're taking some liberties here to try to save page size. That use strength and the $ with the document selector. They're not shown, but they're there. And then we've got this display error messages function. As it says, this is new. Receives a single parameter, which has got an array, or I shouldn't even say that. It's got a string that's called messages that's going to go and loop through everything that's in here. All right, it's going to loop through all these. And if either that's an invalid email or it's empty, it'll put a message in there. If this is empty, it'll put a message in there. If this still says select a country, it'll put a message in there. And finally, if the terms of service was not checked, it'll put that message in there. So the CSS is no biggie. This is just saying that, again, we're putting that border around this. So that's our 3-pixel thing. We're making in some padding and setting a margin bottom. What is new here is the fact that we've updated the JavaScript. All right. And as you're working your way through here, what it's doing is it is, at least conceivably, it is building this unordered list from scratch. And that's what they're showing you right here with this display error messages. Now, you only have to do this if there is one or more errors. If there are no errors, meaning, you put something in here, you put something in here, you selected a country and you clicked here, then that's going to be empty. All right. But otherwise, notice what we're doing. We are literally building an unordered list. And we're telling it to basically add those messages to the unordered list. All right. And how are we doing that? Well, we're coming in here through this for loop, and we're saying that with each error message we have, make it a list item. All right. Create a text node for it, and then append that to our unordered list. First append the text to the LI, then append the LI to the UL. Now it says here, if no UL element yet, add it before the form tag. All right, otherwise replace it. So again, in other words, make sure that we've got this in here. And again, as always, if you don't like my verbiage, please take the time to read this. All right. Notice with the process entries, as it says, it's grabbing the controls right there. It's creating an array for the error messages. All right. And then it's going through here, and it's not a string, it's a of strings, Because again, as shown right here, you can have 0 errors, 1 error, 2 errors, 3 errors, or 4 errors. If there are no errors, submit the form. Otherwise, we want to display those error messages, which is going to get us back over here. It'll set everything up for us again, and it'll fill out whatever has to be filled out. All right, so again, it's going through all 4 of the required fields. And you'll notice that with the first 3 fields that are in there, they're all strings. So we're just checking to see if it's equal to double quote, double quote. As I previously mentioned, when I'm working with strings like that, I typically, like with the email.value or the phone.value or the country.value, I'll say email.value.trim, paren, or phone.value.trim, paren, or country.value.trim, paren. And then notice with the terms, we're doing the checked property because that is a checked box. Also, and by now, I should mention this because many of you, when you were doing your test, and it's not that it's wrong, but many of you, when you did the test on chapters 1, 2, and 3, when you were checking for equality, you used 2 equal signs, and that's what our book does. The recommendation by ECMA is that whenever possible, you use the triple equal sign, which again checks not only for the presence or absence or something, but it also does an identity check to make sure that it is the right data type. Okay. All right, and there's our reset form. Okay, so that's about it. So notice what it says here. The goal was to introduce you to some of the capabilities of DOM scripting. All right, and I've done this before. I've already gone out and done this kind of thing. So I'll come out here and I'll say DOM for dummies. All right. And well, that's dominoes. The DOM explained for beginners. I knew this was in there. It's a free code long. All right. But they explain a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in here. By no means, again, is this the only resource there is. All right. There are a lot of them out there. All right. This is a great resource. Now, I should mention this to you. I don't know if I pulled them over or not. I don't really and truly remember. But if you go out and if you have no interest in this, just tune me out. Okay, just for a couple minutes. But if I go out to YouTube and I find me, all right, and there I am. So if I click on there and I do all this stuff and I go over to playlist, I don't know if I put it on this year, the one for this year, but I know I did for the last time I taught this class. So if I go and look here, let's see. Might even be fall 2021. I don't know. But someplace in here, if I look in here, and I don't want to listen to that guy. All right. But if I go and look at the listing of everything that's in there, all right, we go back. All right, and I want to view the full playlist. That's what I wanted to do. Right there. I don't know if I brought them over here or not, but when you start going over here and looking at some of these, what I've done is I went through that whole thing that you see out there, the Mozilla thing that's on there. So I've got tons of stuff out here. All right, some of it I brought over, some of it I may not have brought over. All right. Okay. So that is it for chapter 6. Before we go on to chapter 7, and we're second, I want to show you that as far as the homework in the labs, this one for chapter 6, in this exercise, you'll use radio buttons. And what should happen in here is, notice on here, it says Fahrenheit to Celsius. That's the one that's checked. So this says F degrees, and this says degrees Celsius. On the other hand, if we flipped it, then notice it now says C degrees and degrees Fahrenheit. So we are changing, we are manipulating the way that our interface looks. We're doing that based upon what the user has chosen for their method of wanting to go from Fahrenheit to Celsius or from Celsius to Fahrenheit. All right. We'll probably end up doing this one as a class next week. And if you put in something invalid, so we'll probably set it up what they had before, that the values were like negative 100 to positive 212 or something like that. So if you put in either non-numeric or empty or out of range, we'll get a message down here. So we'll look at that one. Then next, we've got this test score array. All right, it says in this exercise, you will work with an array and you'll add nodes to the DOM to display the results and the scores. So in other words, in the past, we have done pretty much this, that you can keep adding stuff in here and get an average. All right. But now what we're going to do also is, as we're doing that, we're going to be creating an array on the fly with everybody's test in there, and we'll be giving the high score. So the average here, which is a 90, should be 88 plus 98 plus 77 plus 88 plus 99 divided by 5. We very well might do that one as a class too. I don't know. The last one for chapter 6 is to modify this FAQ application. All right. It says here only one answer should be able to be displayed at a time. I'm going to ask that you try to do that one yourselves. They tell you what to do here. Then in chapter 7, I don't know if I'm going to assign either one of these or not. It's kind of a neat one here. It makes a clock. All right. And it's a working clock too. And then in here, you go and modify it so that not only do you have the working clock, but you make a stopwatch. All right. And that's it for chapters 6 and 7 here. And then under our other one, 6, this one I'd like to do as a class. And again, it says you will upgrade this so that the error messages are displayed in span elements. All right. And what I may ask you to do, because next week we'll set it up the same kind of way. And what I mean is tomorrow's lab, all right, then on Monday we'll do a few of these as a class. Plus on Monday, I will give you some kind of a pretest, all right, and give you time to work on that. All right, maybe give you the whole period and go over it Wednesday. I don't know. And then Thursday of next week, we go over chapters 8 and 9. That's probably the way that it'll work. All right. So that's the one for 6-1. So these are the two fields that are required. So if you either leave them blank or put a non-numeric or an out of range value, those are the messages that should come up. All right. This is another thing with a test score array. As it says, it displays the names and the scores over here in this text area. Very well might let you try to do that one yourselves. And then for chapter 7, this is what we're going to be going over right now. Preloading images and using a timer. All right, so let's jump into that. I'll go till about 10:10. If I don't finish, we'll take one last break and then finish it afterwards. So let me jump right in to chapter 7, which is not a particularly long chapter. All right, so it's how to work with images and timers. Now, as far as creating an HTML image element object, that goes back to what we just talked about. And we saw how to do that using both the DOM specification and the HTML. So the full DOM spec and the HTML DOM spec in the last chapter. Then we will talk about image swaps, and there's different ways you can do that. Then we will look at timers, and then quickly look at a slideshow application. Again, not a long chapter. So it says this chapter presents some additional skills for working with images and timers. I do want to mention one thing just so you hear about it ahead of time. All right. Now, it says how to use timers. And they talk about a one-time timer and an interval timer. Now, I'm dating myself here when I show you this picture, but I'm going to go out to images.google.com and I'm going to put down alarm clock. And probably you've all seen something that looks like this. All right, maybe even in a picture. But the idea with something like this is that you set the alarm. All right, you set the alarm and you set it for 8 o'clock and it goes off at 8 o'clock. You press the buttons and it turns off. All right. For years, that was the type of alarm that everybody had, the type of alarm clock. Well, then we went from there, and instead of having that, most people would have something like a clock radio. And the cool thing about a clock radio then was that you could go right here and you could hit snooze and you could sleep for 10 more minutes and then it would go off again. You could usually do that for an hour. What does that have to do with anything? Well, a one-time timer is like the old-fashioned type of, it's one and done. You set it, it goes off, you turn it off, you're done. An interval timer is more like the clock radio. So keep that in mind when we get to that point. Finally, we'll end up looking at a slideshow application. All right. So it says many web applications manipulate images that they display in a browser. All right. You've seen these kind of things before. I've given you examples of these. As an example, and not probably the ones that they'll show, but I'm going to come in here and let's see if I put in, I saw a commercial for them this morning. All right. Maybe it's not going to show anything. There we go. All right. This isn't swapping, but notice they've got before and after pictures. All right. And a lot of times you'll see that what they'll show you is maybe they'll show you the before picture. When you put your mouse on it, you'll see the after picture, kind of an idea. All right. So there's a lot of different ways that you can manipulate these things if you want to or need to on a website. So it says there, figure 7.1 lists some of the attributes for element. When we look at these, there's nothing new in here. We have seen all of this stuff in here before. The source, of course, is mandatory because that's got the URL of what you want to show. The alt today is considered rather to be mandatory, especially for those people who are vision impaired. You'd want an alt attribute in there. The width and the height, typically, they're not shown. All right. Just to show you real quick, too, this is off subject, but yet not totally. We're working on an application in the afternoon class, and we're going to be creating a book site, a book website. And in here, what I had to do was I found a site that has 108 different books in there. And notice when I double click and I start going through, what I get. I went in and I manually changed the size. You can tell I manually changed the size of all these images so they were 300 by 300. But if I click here, that's the size it originally was. So you can see what happens. All right. So I manually went in and changed image size. I didn't use software to do it. I shouldn't say I didn't use software. I went into Paint and changed it myself. So it eventually gets to be the right size, but that's a little bit, in my opinion at least, is a little bit disturbing to do it like that. All right, there's other packages, better ones that I could have used that would have changed it forever, so to speak. But usually when you're doing this stuff, you are not going to jack with the width and the height. And if for some reason you do want to do that, sorry, you do want to, you would do it inside of the CSS. I can't see a reason for putting that in the HTML. All right. So it says in most cases, you'll use imaging software to create images that are the right size for your web page. Okay. All right. Now, to work with an image element, it says you use an HTML element image object. So what we are talking about doing is, again, having the ability to, as an example, have images appear and disappear, transition in and out, or as they say here, you can even preload images. The preloading images can be important is that if you've got very intricate images, they can potentially take a long time to load. And if the person loading has got a slow connection to begin with, that may be long enough for them to leave your page. All right. So as it says, to solve this problem, an application can load the images before a user event occurs. It's known as preloading the images. All you're trying to do is to help the user experience. All right. So here they're creating an image object, and in here they're doing the preload by setting up its source. And that may not sound like much, but you could have an array of these. You could have hundreds of these. All right. I remember once, and maybe I've told you this before, maybe I haven't, no big thing. I'm a frustrated karaoke singer. And I remember when I used to live in Illinois that I was looking one night for a different place to go karaokeing because the place I went to was just so busy that, you'd sing one song and it'd be an hour before you could sing another one. Well, I went to this one site for a bar. And what happened was there was a little delay of a few seconds. And then after that delay, about 50 pictures, they were all thumbnails, showed up on the screen. And you could click any of the thumbnails and it would show a full screen size shot of what was in there. But it was preloading those images. All right. And as it says here, when an application preloads, it loads all of the images it's going to need when the page loads and stores these in the web browser's cache for future use. When the images are preloaded, the browser can display them whenever they're needed without any kind of delay. To preload an image, you need a new HTML image object. Then, as it says, you set its source to be what you want it to be. All right. So the next thing that's shown in here is this image application. So you've got 4 different thumbnails in here. And when you take your mouse and you click on any one of these, so right now I clicked on the third one. That's what's showing here. If I were to click on this one, I don't know, that's a buffalo or whatever, then that would show in here. All right. And you can set them up in different ways. What do I mean? Well, if I wanted to, that would be with some kind of a click event. I could set it up with a mouse over event so that if I put my mouse here, that would change in here when my mouse was over here. When I move my mouse out, I could change it to a default or have nothing here, and I could work my way across here. So there's a lot of different ways this could be set up. So when we look at this, this is our HTML. And you'll notice that when you take a look in here, we have created an unordered list, and that unordered list is going to have right now the thumbnails. So what we're doing here, all right, is we are putting in this. Okay. And then depending on which one of those you click on, we will change the big image that's shown down below, down in here. You'll notice that they're basically the only CSS in there is the LIs to display inline, because otherwise, instead of these being in one row, they'd be in one in each of 4 different rows. All right, now when we look next, we'll get the JavaScript. So let's look at the JavaScript first, then come back and see if there's anything in here we have to look at. All right, our typical alias line at the beginning. All right, the DOM loaded. And what are we doing in here? It pretty much is what you think it would be. So we're grabbing a list of each one of these, get all the A tags that are in here. Then we're working our way through to see which one we have currently clicked on. And once we click on something, we are changing the image and the caption so that they go along with what we clicked on. And again, you don't like my description? Take a read in here. All right. Now, think about this, okay? And I'm not sure how I'm going to do it yet, because I'm going to be writing it probably this weekend. And that is what I'm planning on doing. What I'm planning on doing is for your pretest for chapters 6 and 7. There'll be probably 3 problems on it. 2 of the 3 will be the ones you just had, the BMI, and then I will ask you to do another thing with images. All right. I'm not sure yet what that'll be. All right. But that's kind of what you have to look forward to, so to speak. And on your next test, am I going to use the same one, the rock, paper, scissors? I don't know. All right. That's too far out for me to think about right now. Possibly. Put it that way. All right. Okay. So that's it for images. So for timers, and we will finish this up. I'm just going to go, if I have to, till 10:15, and then it'll be it for the period. All right. And a timer, as it says, allows you to execute a function after a specified period of time has elapsed. Now, back in the olden days, like when I first started teaching, and I was more your age, all right, then we didn't have Microsoft Word. In fact, there was no Microsoft suite of projects. Rather, we used something that was called Word Perfect. It was kind of the precursor, or what you had before Word. The reason I'm telling you that is, rather than now, when there was a lot of, right now, if I use Microsoft Word and I go and type a bunch of stuff in and I don't save it, all right, if I don't save it and I get out, it's going to say first, you want to save what you were working on. All right, so I could do that if I wanted to. Well, by default, when you used Word Perfect, every 10 minutes, if you didn't save your document, it saved it for you. So you'd see a message down on the bottom of the screen that would just say something like, WordPerfect has saved your document. All right. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, there was a timer in there that every 10 minutes that timer went off. It made something happen, which was doing the save, and it made a message appear on the screen saying that the save had been done. All right. Notice timers are provided by web browsers rather than by the DOM or by ECMA standards. They're often useful in doing different things. They give an example like a slideshow that they'll show in just a minute. Timers so that every 4 or 5 seconds or whatever, you go from one slide to the other. So they talk about the two types of timers. I've already mentioned them to you, but let's just talk about them one more time. A one-time timer should make sense. It's basically, it only does something once. So it says to do that, you use the set timeout. The idea is when something happens, boom, you're going to call some routine to do something. But if you're only doing it once, it'll be done under the premise of using set timeout. All right. So they do show an example in here. And set timeout, all right, as it says, creates a timer that calls a specified function once. Well, as an example, I mean, I do have, it's not a clock radio, but it's the equivalent of one without the music in it. But I've got an alarm that gets me up every morning. Now, most mornings, and this morning was an example of that, I was awake before it went off. So I just turned off, all right, I turned off the alarm. That's a clear timeout. All right. So notice right here, an application that redirects after 5 seconds if a button isn't clicked. Well, as it says, you will be redirected to our terms of service page shortly, or you can just accept them. So if you say, no, I want to read this first, you can let it time out and it'll move you to another page, as an example. So as they say here, the set timeout method returns a reference to the timer it creates. It can then be used by the clear timeout to cancel it if need be. And interval is what I said to you before. It calls something repeatedly. What does that mean? It means it calls it as often as you tell it to call it. So you will be using a set interval method to say every 10 minutes or every hour or every whatever. All right. And again, there's different ways that you can use this. All right. So the set interval, as it says, creates a timer that calls it each time the specified interval, and it's done in milliseconds, where 1,000 milliseconds equals 1 second has elapsed. And then, as it says, you can clear that set interval by calling clear interval. All right. So as mentioned here on the bottom of the page, the set interval method returns a reference to the timer it creates, can then be used by the clear interval. All right, if you need to cancel the timer. And it says you cannot modify a timer once it's been set, but you can cancel it and reset it. So if something's going off every 10 minutes and you're like, that's too much, I wish it only went off for an hour, you can't automatically reset your interval. You have to instead cancel it, set the number again, and then run it. So the chapter ends here. We've only got a couple more pages. All right, with this slideshow application. Now, it says here, when the user sets this application, it displays a new caption and image every 2 seconds. So this is what's going to happen. There's a couple things about this application I don't like, unless they've changed it. I don't think they have. Number one, the slides aren't all the same height and width. I find it real choppy looking when it goes from one to the other. Okay. Second, rather than showing you this, and it's totally fine what they did, there's nothing wrong with it. But I think it would have been a better example if they would have provided it something down here where you could have literally said, how many seconds do you want to have pause between going from slide to slide? What you find out is as you're older, all right, especially if there's a lot of text here, with just a couple seconds, you might not have time to read it, or you might want to spend a couple more minutes enjoying it or whatever. Whereas a lot of times when you're younger, especially when you're a really young child, you just bang, bang, bang your way through it. But they didn't give you a way to set the time yourself. and I wish they would have done so. So the JavaScript to do this then is shown in here. I'm not really going to go over it. All right. Now, I do want to mention one last thing as we wrap this chapter up here. I think that was the last page. Yep. And that is this. There are always, when you do this stuff, there are multiple ways that you can do it. What do I mean? Well, as an example, with this, if this was at the top of the screen and this was basically like a slide carousel, you could do a slide carousel and you could set up the interval, etc., and do all of it in JavaScript. Or you could go in and you could do it just with CSS. You can create a slideshow without using JavaScript. Or you could use it in something like Bootstrap. So there's a lot of different ways that the stuff in here could conceivably be done, is what I'm telling you. All right. And we're just looking at some of it. So again, tomorrow will be a lab day. And on Monday, I'm going to figure out which of these we're going to do together and which I'll just assign. Remember, even ones we do together, you are still responsible for doing. All right. I don't know if we'll do the clock and the stopwatch, if we'll do one, both, or neither of them. I don't know yet. I'm not asking for people's opinions. I'll look through it and figure it out myself this weekend. All right. And for the other one, for our short exercises, there's only the one. That one I'd like us to do together so you get some kind of an idea of preloading images and how to use a timer. That one, again, you can plan on us doing together. All right. Okay. So again, on tomorrow will be lab for the entire period. I will be online. I do want to mention something else too. I've said this before, not trying to put anybody, so if this pertains to you, okay, but I've had a couple people in the class who have had, let's just put it this way, that getting some of the work done has been very difficult for them, and they've had very good reasons. I am all caught up. All right, on grading as of right now. You should have gotten an email from me the other day which showed your grade for the first JavaScript test. I've got one person who still has to take that first test. Once that person has taken the test, I will come in the next class period and I will do the test in front of you. And I'll do it very quickly. I'll do it in about 10 minutes or so. But just so you can see, so if you lost points on the test, you'll see how I did it. All right. And then we will do the same thing with the next test. And we will do the same thing with a test after that. Now, just so you know, when we do those kinds of things, when I'm actually doing a test, probably what I'm going to do is I make those YouTube videos private. What that means is you won't be able to go out directly to YouTube to get them. Rather, you will get what's called a YouTube invite from me, where you will be able to click on it and look at the video at any time, but it won't be out there under my channel. That's just in case Mr. G does that test or a similar test, or Doug, I think it's Gebelman, or something like that. The new guy they hired, that he does that. All right. So Grant, unless you had any other questions, that's all I have. Any questions?
No, I don't really know what questions to ask. It's a lot of stuff, but it's sort of clicking with the examples about like that this is stuff that the user is going to influence.
Right. And
I think
I
build them in
okay.
action.
Yeah, I think it'll make more sense when we go through some of the examples on Monday as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, okay. All right. Then I'll talk to you on Monday. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks.